They always said I was the perfect daughter. Abigail, the light of the congregation. The girl who knew the hymns by heart before she even understood what they meant, who wore long skirts and carried a Bible like it was an extension of her body. The one who smiled without showing her teeth, who obeyed without question, who seemed to have no will of her own. I was shaped with care, with discipline, with long prayers and even longer silences. I grew up amid expectations disguised as blessings, and pressures wrapped in scripture verses. My father, Pastor Jonathan Cole, said God had a special plan for me, and everyone in the church nodded like they already knew what it was. I was supposed to marry a good man of faith, serve alongside my dad, maybe lead the children's ministry, give purity testimonies at conferences. They smiled while dreaming my life for me. And I smiled too, because that's what was expected. But there were nights I couldn't sleep, nights I curled up under the covers feeling a restlessness that didn't fit any memorized prayer, a longing to question, to doubt, to scream. But you don't scream in a pastor's house, and it was in that contained emptiness, that nameless ache in my soul, that he appeared. Daniel, a stranger who didn't kneel at the right moments, who sat through services with his arms crossed and his eyes sharp, but never closed, who didn't carry a Bible but carried a different kind of calm. He didn't try to approach me, didn't smile to win me over. He just looked at me, as if he could tell, just from the way I tucked my hair behind my ear, that I was trying to breathe in clothes that weren't mine. And in that moment, in silence, something inside me started to crack, not in rebellion, but in truce. And I realized that everything they taught me about faith hadn't yet taught me anything about myself. In those first days, I pretended not to notice when he showed up, always in the back pew, always discreet, like he didn't want to be seen, but he was. Daniel didn't seem to fit there, and maybe that's what bothered me, or maybe that's what drew me in. I watched him from behind the sung words, in the gaps between one amen and the next, trying to figure out why he was there. He didn't say hallelujah, didn't close his eyes during prayer, and yet there was a strange steadiness in him, a silence that didn't come from indifference, but from someone who'd spent too long searching for answers that didn't fit the ready-made ones. And I knew that feeling well. I just never had the guts to let it spill out of my mouth. The first time we spoke was after a Sunday night service. The sky was overcast, and the air carried that mix of wet grass and church perfume. My parents were surrounded by deacons and elders, all smiling, shaking hands, pretending they weren't judging Daniel's late arrivals, his plain clothes, his unflinching eyes. I slipped out the side door just to breathe. That's when I heard his voice behind me. "That was nice what you said today." I turned. Slowly, I didn't remember saying anything worth noting. I just recited a verse during the opening, like I did every month, but he seemed to have heard something more. It felt like you were talking to someone, not just repeating. I didn't have an answer for a moment, because honestly, that night I had been talking to someone, to myself. For the first time in ages, I just felt it, I mumbled. And he nodded like that was enough. The talk didn't last more than a few minutes. He didn't ask my name, didn't compliment my dress. He just listened, and he left with a simple wave, like he understood that some spaces are too sacred to barge into. But from then on, he started existing in me in a new way, not as a threat, not as a temptation, but as a mirror, a strange reflection of something I'd been hiding inside: doubt, hunger, courage. I started looking for him at services, noticing when he arrived, missing him when he didn't, all without saying a word to anyone, because I knew what it would mean. I was Abigail Cole, the pastor's daughter. I wasn't supposed to get close to a man who didn't pray out loud. But the problem was, every time I tried to ignore that pull, The voice inside me got louder, and for the first time, I didn't want to silence it. I wanted to hear it through to the end. Over the weeks, his name started haunting my thoughts with a frequency that scared me. Daniel. He crept into my prayers, even when I didn't say it aloud. He showed up in the spaces between words, in the periods I lingered over too long. I caught myself glancing at the back pew before services began. When he wasn't there, my heart sank a little. When he was, I pretended not to care. And that, in itself, was already a problem. Because nothing in the life I knew was built on pretending, at least not my own pretending. We'd run into each other by chance, at the church library, the downtown bookstore, the coffee shop across from the square. He always came with that easy calm, never forcing talk, never trying to impress. He listened like he really wanted to understand, not like he was waiting for his turn to speak. And I, raised to listen and only reply when needed, started saying more. Not everything, but enough to realize there was life in me beyond the church walls. One day, after a prayer service, he waited outside. He was leaning against a pole, hands in his pockets, eyes on the sky. I walked over without thinking too hard, and he looked at me with the honesty that unraveled me inside. Ever wanted to just leave, just to find out who you really are? I froze. The question cut through me like a knife, because that was exactly what I felt, but I'd never said it, even to myself. I didn't know if he meant faith, family, the world, or all of it together. I just nodded, my throat tightening. He didn't push, just gave a half smile, like he was saying, I get it. And in that moment, something between us shifted. It wasn't love, not yet. It was subtler, more dangerous. A kind of intimacy born when two people spot the loneliness in each other and step closer not to fill it, but to not sink alone. That night, back home, I sat on my bed staring at the Bible on my nightstand. It was the same copy I'd had since I was 13, full of notes, highlights, and memories of who I'd been. I grabbed a pen and wrote tiny in an empty spot at the bottom of a Proverbs page. What if I'm searching too? I closed the book, carefully, like I was hiding a secret. The next morning, looking in the mirror, I saw something different in my eyes. It wasn't doubt, it was hunger. Hunger for something I couldn't yet name, but that I instinctively felt was starting with him. That Wednesday, he waited for me after choir practice. He was outside, leaning against his car, arms crossed, gaze distant. I hesitated for seconds. That felt too long. Every step toward him was a defiance of everything I'd been taught. But I went, because by then, there was something in me that wouldn't obey anymore, something that didn't ask permission or wait for a green light. He didn't smile. Neither did I. We just stood face to face, like two strangers who knew too much about each other without ever touching. There's a trail by the lake, real quiet. No one will recognize you there, he said, straight to the point. It wasn't an invitation. It was almost a test. I should have said no, should have remembered who I was, or rather, who I'd always been taught to be. But in that moment, my father's words, the congregation's stares, the warnings I'd heard since I was a kid, they all felt so small next to the simple fact that someone for the first time was seeing me beyond the altar. I went, without telling anyone. I threw on a loose sweater, tied my hair back in a way that made me less pastor's daughter and more someone who could blend in. When I got there, he was already waiting. We walked in silence for minutes that started awkward, then turned. Completely freeing. He didn't talk much, but everything he said felt pulled from somewhere deep, honest. He told me about his mom dying when he was a teenager, about a dad who used religion as a shield to feel nothing, about the years he spent trying to please a God who only seemed to drift further away with every effort. And then he asked me, "Do you believe everything they taught you?" I stopped. I didn't answer right away. That was a forbidden question, not because it couldn't be asked, but because once you let it in, there was no going back. I took a deep breath and said, "I did. But lately, I've been believing less in answers and more in questions." He nodded, like he got it, like it was true for him too. We sat on the edge of a rock, watched the sun dip, painting everything, orange and uncertain. The silence between us was thick, not comfortable but necessary. The kind of silence that marks a before and an after. When he brushed his hand against mine, lightly, without force, my body tensed. But I didn't pull away. Because in that touch, so small and so forbidden, I felt something no prayer had ever given me. Presence. Not divine, not heavenly, but human, warm, imperfect. And for the first time, I wanted to stay there, not for the beauty of it, but because there, for the first time, I wasn't performing. That night, lying in bed, I heard my mom praying in the next room. Sweet, steady words, like a song that had rocked me my whole life, but everything in me felt somewhere else. I didn't want to be the Abigail everyone knew anymore, and at the same time, I didn't know who this version was, emerging in silence, between the touch of a hand and the absence of certainties. I just knew she wasn't going away, and that, from then on, any way back would mean betraying something that, for the first time, felt true. The days after that looked the same on the outside, but nothing inside me was the same. I still woke up early, read devotionals with my mom, sat through services next to my dad, answered every "God bless you" with a smile. But there was a crack in me now, a thin line between what I showed and what I lived. And the harder I tried to hold steady on the surface, the deeper I sank inside, because my mind didn't bend as easily to old certainties anymore, and my heart started beating to a rhythm that didn't match the altar. I kept seeing Daniel, not often, not with promises, but with that quiet urgency of someone who knows what they feel doesn't fit the molds they were taught to follow. Our talks grew longer. Sometimes we'd walk without saying a word, but it was like the silences between us had their own meanings. He never pressured me, never tried to convert me to anything, but it was exactly that lack of control that started shaking me up. Because everything in my life had always come with instructions: how to pray, how to dress, how to love God, how to obey my parents, how to hush my doubts. Daniel didn't tell me what to do. He just looked at me. And in that look was a silent permission to hear myself, something I'd never known how to do alone. One day, I asked him why he stopped believing. It wasn't planned. It slipped out raw, in the middle of a talk about childhood. He went quiet for too long. Then he told me about his little sister dying. Said he prayed for days, non-stop, until his voice gave out. That his dad said she'd die if there was hidden sin in the house. That no one showed up to the funeral. That the next day, the pastor said it was all part of God's plan. Daniel didn't cry, as he told me, didn't raise his voice. But in that moment, I understood everything. It wasn't that he'd stopped believing. It was that his faith had been shattered and left on the floor in front of a pain no one would touch. He didn't run from God. God, or what they said was God, never showed up when he needed it most. That stayed with me for days. I prayed like never before, trying to find the right words to justify, to heal, to understand. But the more I prayed, the more confused I felt. Because for the first time, my faith put me at odds with love. And not just any love, a love that didn't demand applause, didn't require certainties, didn't come to save me, but to show me that maybe for the first time, I had something worth saving. My truce. At church, the whispers started. About me. About him. The lingering looks, the shorter greetings, the invitations that stopped coming. Someone saw us walking together in the square, and in our world, that was more than enough to set off alarms. My dad called me in for a talk, with that sweet, dangerous tone he used when he wanted to sound worried, but was furious. Said he'd noticed changes in me, that I was distracted, vulnerable, and it was pulling me from my calling. Wanted to know what was going on. And for the first time, I didn't know how to lie, but I couldn't tell the truth either. I stayed silent, and he looked at me like, in that moment, I'd stopped being his daughter and become a threat to our family's image. That night I cried in the dark of my room, but not from regret, from fear. Fear of losing the sliver of freedom I'd found. Fear of not being able to love without breaking everything. Fear of finally being close to who I was, and not knowing how to hold on to it without letting everything else go. There was something in me that wouldn't hide anymore, no matter how hard I tried to keep the rituals intact. The way I smiled wasn't the same. The words that used to flow easy, memorized verses, ready answers, now stuck in my throat. I started stumbling over prayers in public. My hands, once clasped with automatic reverence, sometimes trembled faintly, and my eyes didn't lock on the altar like they used to. I looked for him, for Daniel, even when he wasn't there, even when I told myself I needed to stop. But stop what, exactly? Stop seeing someone who made me feel more alive than any packed service? Stop loving someone who, without promising anything, made me feel whole for the first time? Stop feeling guilty for something that deep down I couldn't call wrong anymore? Daniel didn't tell me he loved me. He didn't need to. His love was in the way he waited across the street so I wouldn't be exposed, in how he listened when I talked about my family with a shaky voice, in the silence he kept when he saw I was torn inside. He didn't demand anything from me, but that's exactly what disarmed me, because I grew up in a world where love came, with rules, with goals, with behavior standards. Daniel loved me without trying to shape me, and that taught me more about God than all the services I'd sat through in 23 years. Little by little, things started crumbling. Small details that took on the weight of grave sins. The church ladies began commenting that my dress was tighter, that I seemed distracted, that there was something different in my face, like joy could be a sign of straying too. One of them asked, all subtle and spiteful, if I was getting involved with someone from the world. I didn't answer, just smiled, with the practiced calm of someone carrying chaos inside. My dad got more present, more watchful, started calling me to pray with him, watching me when I talked to other guys, pushing me to get closer to a new guy at church, fresh out of seminary, with a bright future. I listened, nodded, kept up appearances, but inside, everything burned, because pretending wasn't possible anymore. I'd tasted freedom. I'd felt the touch of someone who didn't treat me like an extension of a calling, but as a woman with flesh, soul, and doubt. By then, Daniel knew everything about me, about my dad, about the church, about the pressure tightening around my neck like a noose, and still he stayed. Stayed even when I told him it'd be better if he left. Stayed even when I talked about sin and guilt with a trembling voice. He'd look at me steady and say, "You can call it sin, but what I see in you is courage. Courage." That word broke me wide open because I didn't feel courageous. I felt fragile, torn, like someone trying to build a future on the rubble of a world I hadn't yet had the guts to leave behind. And then came the day my mom walked into my room and found the letter. It wasn't a confession, just a draft I'd written to myself, where I admitted for the first time in words that I was in love with someone outside the faith. She didn't say anything right then, just left, paper in hand, eyes welling up. Hours later, my dad called me into his office. His tone was heavy, his look heavier. I knew something had snapped, In that moment, I realized what came next wouldn't be veiled judgment or subtle pressure anymore. It'd be confrontation. It'd be exposure. It'd be me, standing before the altar I was raised on, seen not as the daughter of promise, but as the potential cause of shame. And yet, as much as it hurt, as much as it terrified me, a part of me didn't want to turn back. That Sunday's sermon was about obedience. My dad preached with more force than usual, like he wanted it clear who he was aiming at and who he meant to hit. He talked about rebellion with honeyed words, cited biblical women as models of submission and loyalty, and every sentence carried a carefully aimed arrow. But it wasn't the weight of the message that crushed me. It was that I didn't feel guilty anymore for not fitting it. I was there, in the front row, dressed below the knees, eyes on the altar, but my soul was somewhere else. After the service, he called me in again. No beating around the bush. Said he knew that the letter was enough, that the brothers were already talking, that my closeness to Daniel was jeopardizing not just my reputation, but our family's image, the ministry, the church. He used words I'd known since I was a kid. Sin, straying, temptation, the enemy's influence. Said there was still time, that I could walk away from him, that I could ask forgiveness, that I could go back to being who I'd always been. But I wasn't that girl anymore, and even without the courage to say it outright, my face already gave me away. "You don't know this man," he said. "You don't know what he carries." I looked at him and answered with a calm that startled. "Me, maybe not, but he's never tried to silence me. And you've been doing that my whole life. It was the first time I saw my dad lose his footing. He didn't yell, didn't hit me, but he stepped back, eyes watering, and in that moment I knew something between us had broken, not forever, but for real. That same night I went to Daniel's place. It was the first time I'd taken the step to find him. I knocked on the door with shaky hands. He answered, worry in his eyes, like he already knew something had shifted. I went in, sat down, told him everything, word for word. My dad, the letter, the ultimatum. He didn't react with surprise, just sighed deep, came closer, sat beside me. "You know what this is gonna cost you?" I nodded. He stayed quiet for a while, then looked at me with the pain of someone who'd already lost everything once. "I can't promise it'll hurt less." "I don't want less hurt," I said. "I just want to know I'm living for something that's mine, not borrowed, not forced. Mine." He held out his hand, and this time I was the one who gripped it tight. In the days that followed, the rumors spread. Some whispered prayers for me, others avoided me. The church leadership called a meeting, offered counseling, restoration, fasting. But what they really wanted was for me to deny it all, to erase Daniel from my life like he was a misstep, to fit again. But I didn't fit anymore. And then came the final question, delivered with the gentleness of a verdict. "Do you choose this relationship or your fellowship with the church?" That was it. The question that closed off any room for talk. The question that to them should have been easy to answer. But for me, it was the chance to finally be whole. The answer came out of me like it had been ready for a long time. I choose the truth. I didn't need to say more. The silence that followed spoke louder than any explanation. The senior pastor lowered his eyes. The ministry coordinator looked away. My dad, at the head of the table, kept his hands clasped like always, but his face was defeat, a quiet defeat, not mine, his. And I understood right there with a pain that pierced my chest that it wasn't just a daughter he saw slipping away. It was the idea of control slipping through his fingers. It was the weight of the title, the name, the image. I was a public crack, and for him, nothing was harder to face. I left that room with shaky legs. My heart wasn't racing, but heavy. like walking away from a funeral without knowing exactly who I was mourning. I didn't cry, not then. There was something in me that stood firm, not strong, firm. Because strength is loud, it's a shield. But firmness is what's left when you decide you won't bend anymore. I walked out of that building like someone carrying their own body with their own hands. And even though everything around me felt empty, there was a certainty in me worth holding on to. In the days after, the exclusion didn't hit like a direct blow. It came subtler. Invitations stopped. Eyes turned away. God bless you started sounding more like condolences than blessings. My mom for a while tried to keep things normal. Set my plate at the table, folded my clothes in silence, taped verses to the mirror. But I saw in her eyes the anguish of someone praying for a miracle without knowing if she wanted it to happen. She wanted me back. But deep down, she knew the version they'd built was gone. With Daniel, silence settled in for a bit too. Not because we ran out of words, but because now the relationship was a raw, open line. No hiding, no masks, no protection. I wasn't the pastor's daughter anymore. He wasn't the stranger in the back pews. Now it was just us. Two bodies carrying wounded faith, fractured hope, and a courage born from our own scars. One night after a quiet dinner, he looked at me and said, "You knew this would hurt, but you didn't hesitate. Why?" I took a while to answer. And when I did, I didn't even know the words were already in me, because I grew up waiting to be saved by God, by the church, by obedience. And what I found out is, I just needed to stop abandoning myself. He didn't say anything, just pulled me close, and we stayed like that. Silent, but a different silence now. Not fear, presence, acceptance, shelter. The world around us was still the same. The small town, the whispers, the broken expectations. But what was between us was new and as uncertain as the road ahead was. For the first time, I walked like someone who knows where they're stepping. The exclusion I'd feared so much turned out quieter than I'd imagined, but far lonelier. The days dragged with an almost cruel slowness. There was no scandal, no showdowns, just silence. The absence of the church was like a hollow echo inside me. I still knew the service times, still recognized the voices singing on Sunday nights. Sometimes I'd walk streets that reminded me of who I'd been, and I'd wonder step by step if I'd ever feel nostalgia without guilt. But something started shifting, slowly, like everything real does. I started reading the Bible again, but without rushing, without goals, without fear. Not to preach, not to please anyone, just to listen. I found verses they'd never explained to me. Stories that took on new meaning now that I wasn't reading them through the lens of perfection. God wasn't a distant voice demanding purity anymore. He was something closer, more compassionate, like he was sitting beside me, quiet, just waiting for me to stop running long enough to find myself. With Daniel, the relationship took on a new shade, calmer, deeper. We weren't driven by risk anymore, but by trust. We shared books, ideas, silences. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we laughed late into the night. But it was all more human, more possible. I learned that loving isn't losing yourself in someone. It's letting yourself be whole beside someone who chooses to be whole too. He still didn't say, "I love you" often, but he'd bring me coffee just how I liked it. Memorized my class schedule, left little notes on scraps of paper he found around the house. And when he saw me sad, he didn't try to fix it, just stayed. And to me that was love. My mom reached out after almost a month of not talking, invited me to lunch, made chicken pot pie, like the Sundays when I was a kid. At first it was all politeness between us, but mid-conversation she cried, said she loved me even if she didn't understand what I was doing, that she couldn't see the world like I did, but she couldn't bear losing me. I said I missed her too. But that For the first time, I felt like I was living something true, that it wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about whole or broken. She held my hand, didn't say she understood, but didn't let go either, and that was enough. That night, I realized maybe not every bond had to break for me to be free. Some just needed rebuilding with different words, different eyes, and for the first time, I started picturing a future where faith wasn't a cage, but a choice. Time didn't fix everything, but it fixed enough. I learned some wounds don't heal, to disappear, but to remind you where it hurts and where you don't want to go back. There were still days the past tugged at my heels, especially passing the church on Sundays and hearing the hymns I grew up singing. Nostalgia hit like a heavy breeze, like an old scent that won't fade from your skin. But I didn't blame myself for missing it anymore. Because now I knew I could honor my story without chaining myself to it. With Daniel, love stopped being a refuge and became a space where I could breathe without hiding. Our relationship matured in the quiet of small choices, sharing routines, respecting each other's time, listening even when it stung. We weren't perfect. We argued, went silent, messed up, but we always came back. And that coming back held everything together, because now I got it. Really loving someone means accepting they're not here to fill a void, but to walk beside it. And walking together takes more than pretty promises. It takes presence, even when the other's faith is a field you don't understand, but learn to step through carefully. One day, in a calm talk on the porch, Daniel asked if I still believed. Not in the God of my childhood, not in the system that raised me, but in something bigger, something that made sense in the woman I was becoming. I looked at him, took a deep breath, and said, I do. But today, God looks more like freedom than rules, more like love than fear, and more like me than any mold they tried to force me into. He smiled like he already knew, and I smiled back like I finally did too. My dad hasn't talked to me like he used to. Our conversations are short, thick with silence. But something in him seems to be wrestling with what he saw collapse. Not for me, for himself. And I hope one day he finds peace outside perfection too. That he sees faith isn't measured by blind obedience, but by the courage to love even when love doesn't fit the holy books. As for me, I keep going, keep doubting, believing, trying. But now, I do it with my chest open. I don't ask permission to exist anymore. Don't blame myself for wanting more than they offered. And don't confuse silence with sanctity. Today, when someone asks who I am, I don't say I'm the pastor's daughter, or the one who left the church, or the one who chose a love they didn't approve of. I say, with a steady, quiet voice, I'm someone who finally figured out faith and freedom don't have to be enemies. They just need to come from truth. Sometimes, I still hear hymns in my head. They pop up on the simplest days while I'm washing dishes or walking the town streets. And when they do, I don't run anymore. I let them play, let them wash through me. Not as a memory of something I lost, but as part of who I was. Like that girl in long skirts and obedient eyes still lives somewhere in me. Not trapped anymore, but at peace. I've learned freedom isn't the absence of roots, but the courage to choose where to plant your feet. And faith, for me, has become that too. An open road, not needing certainties to be walked. Just presence, just truth. Daniel's still by my side, not as salvation, but as company. Sometimes we talk about God without settling anything. Other times we just share the silence. And it's in that space, between words and not knowing, that we've built our home. A home without an altar, but with love. Without dogma, but with respect. Without eternal vows, but with daily choices. My mom calls more often now, still prays for me, but doesn't try to pull me back anymore. I think she's realized I'm not lost, just somewhere else. A place without pews or a pulpit, but with solid ground, with open sky. And me? I keep going, with faith. Not the one they gave me, but the one born in me. Quiet, imperfect, alive. And that is more than enough.